This isn't 2008, but it's also not 2021 either. If you buy a home in Vancouver in 2026, there's a real chance you're going to lose money. Not just in theory, and not just a worst case scenario, but just mathematically. It's very possible it's going to happen. So today I want to answer one fundamental question: why buying a home in Vancouver in 2026 could be a bad idea if you intend to sell within the next year or two. And what's just as important to note is that if you intend to buy and hold that property for the next 5 to 10 years, this market might actually make all kinds of rational sense. But to understand that, we have to zoom way out. For years, Vancouver has felt like a bit of a cheat code. You could buy anything and wait long enough, and eventually prices would rise. It trained an entire generation to believe that prices largely only go up in real estate. But here's a bit of the uncomfortable truth. That story only works when prices are rising fast enough to cover your mistakes. And right now in Vancouver, prices aren't rising, and expensive mistakes are causing people to go broke. Prices have already corrected from their peak. In fact, some markets are down more than 25%. Sales volumes are also a lot lower, and inventory remains very high. Buyers are, for the most part, very cautious and under no pressure at all to buy a home. Unlike past slowdowns, this one isn't just local. This one is complex. There's economics at play, there's politics at play, and it is entirely global. Let's look at the economic chain reaction that a lot of people have missed. How in Canada did we end up here in the position that we're in? Well, let's look at historic interest rates and what is arguably going to come down to is the money era. For more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, money was dirt cheap, historically cheap for that matter. Central banks, including the Bank of Canada, kept interest rates near zero. Governments printed money and credit expanded. Asset prices exploded. Housing didn't rise because houses got better or neighborhoods improved. Housing rose because borrowing became easier and because the value of your purchasing power went down dramatically. When rates are at near 0%, buyers can borrow a lot more. It doesn't cost as much. Investors can speculate for longer for the very same reason. And prices stretch far beyond their fundamentals. And that's how Vancouver reached levels where ownership stopped being about shelter and really started being about leverage. Then inflation hit. The next part of the story comes down to inflation, rate shock, and a sudden stop. When inflation surges, central banks have no choice. And as a result, rates moved up, also historically fast. And this matters more in Canada than it does anywhere else. Why? Because Canada has one of the highest debt to household GDP ratios of the G7. It also has short mortgage terms, typically 3 to 5 years, which means frequent renewals. And when rates jump in Canada because of this, housing feels it immediately. Monthly payments rise, buyer demand drops, sellers begin to hesitate, and transactions slow down to a grinding halt. And that's exactly what we've seen over the last 3 years and explains a lot of what the market that we find ourselves in today. A price correction, not a crash, but enough to change the math almost entirely. And that leads to the real risk in 2026. There's a lot of political uncertainty. There's trade war hangovers, and we just came off of a fresh election cycle. Canada does not operate in a vacuum. The global economy is still living with the aftershocks of Trump's trade war, tariffs, these reshaped supply chains, and as a result, I think we live in a more fractured world. These policies introduced under Donald Trump didn't just affect the US, they destabilized global trade norms that Canada largely depends on. When you add to that, you've got ongoing geopolitical tension, you've got Venezuela, Greenland, even Canada has been joked about. You've got Taiwan, you've got Iran, you've got all these different pieces that are moving right now, creating instability and a flight to safety. That largely freezes decision-making, especially major ones. And then on top of that, we've had a large amount of capital flight out of Canada, including reducing immigration for the first time in Canada's history. When uncertainty rises, capital flow stops. And when capital slows down, housing markets lose momentum. Welcome to where we are today. So Canada has a specific problem, and it's more to do with a per capita GDP performance than anything else. Because Canada technically avoided a classic recession. When you also have more people and not enough productivity, that typically means lower per capita GDP output. You've got more and more people chasing fewer jobs. This creates a strange housing environment. Demand exists, but affordability doesn't. And that's why prices don't collapse. But they also are not going to surge. They stall, they wobble, they move sideways. And sideways markets are dangerous for short-term buys or short-term sells. So the real decision here is who shouldn't buy and who should buy. If you're planning to buy now and then sell within the next 12 to 24 months, it's purely speculative. Here's why the risk is too high, in my opinion. Transaction costs alone can eat somewhere between 4 to 8% of the property's value. Price growth is largely uncertain, at least over the next couple of years, and carrying costs are still elevated. Buyer sentiment is still quite fragile. And if prices move sideways or even dip, you don't lose on paper, you lose in real nominal dollars. This is the type of market that people rarely panic in, but they just quietly regret buying too early. Here's the context that most people miss. Real estate isn't just one decision, it's two. It's when you buy, but it's also how long you hold that property for. If you're buying in Vancouver with the intention of owning for at least 5 to 10 years, the story changes completely. This is why long-term buyers might actually do very well. You're buying after a correction. Prices are no longer at peak euphoria levels, and that matters. Your downside risk is a lot lower than it was just a year ago, let alone 2 or even 3 years ago. Rates don't typically have to fall in order for this to maintain, but you hope that they don't surge again. Even modest rate relief over time will improve affordability, and that is something that we've been seeing. Long-term owners benefit from this kind of optionality. The other thing, too, is that buyers are typically buying in stability now, not momentum. Housing works best as a house when the market is boring. There's no bidding wars, there's no panic, and no FOMO. This market will reward you if you choose to negotiate, if you have patience, if you have conditional offers and long-term planning. When you can use those as a buyer, you can typically set yourself up well for the long term. So this is turning out to be far more of a long-term buyer's market than it is any kind of short-term speculation. Let's look at Vancouver's structural reality, because that also hasn't really changed. When you look at geography, immigration, limited land, global demand, these are not going to disappear in one economic cycle. They just stop overpowering everything else in the meantime. So the bottom line, if you're buying a home in 2026, it's a bad idea if you need prices to rise quickly and if you plan to sell soon, or your budget only works if those things go right. But it may be a very rational decision if you're planning to stay 5 to 10 years, or you value stability over speculation. You understand that this is a hold, a place to live, a lifestyle decision. It's not a flip. This market does not reward optimism. It rewards patience. And that's a very different kind of opportunity, especially in how you approach it.